My husband thanked me for a dinner I never cooked, for a conversation I never had, for a night I couldn't remember living. At first, I thought I was losing my mind. Then I realized someone else had been wearing my life like a coat while I wasn't looking. Someone who knew my face better than anyone alive because it was already her own. My name is Solange. I have an identical twin sister named Delphine. We spent our whole lives being mistaken for each other. This is the story of the one time she made sure of it on purpose. People who aren't twins never really understand what it's like to share a face with someone else. It isn't just looking alike. It's a lifetime of being called the wrong name by teachers who never bothered to learn the difference, of friends grabbing the wrong sister's arm in a crowded hallway, of relatives at family reunions squinting at you for a full 3 seconds before committing to a guess. Delphine and I were identical down to the smallest detail. Same gap in our front teeth, same small mole under our left eye, same laugh that our mother used to say she could recognize blindfolded from across a church parking lot. For most of our childhood, being mistaken for one another was just background noise, an inconvenience we'd learned to shrug off before we were old enough to understand it might one day be used as a weapon. The trouble between Delphine and me didn't start in adulthood. It started when we were 19, over a boy neither of us even ended up with, but the wound it left never fully closed. She had liked him first. I hadn't known that, not really, not the depth of it, until after he and I had already started seeing each other. When she found out, she didn't scream or cry or confront me directly. She went quiet in a specific way I would come to recognize over the years as far more dangerous than any shouting match, a coldness that settled into her like weather, one that didn't lift for months. Our mother, Augustine, tried to smooth it over the way mothers of twins often do, telling Delphine there would be other boys, telling her sisters shouldn't let anything come between them. But something had shifted permanently that year. A fault line running underneath everything that came after, even once the relationship with that boy had ended and become nothing more than a distant memory to me. What I didn't understand then, and only came to understand many years later, was that Delphine hadn't just resented losing the boy. She'd resented, quietly and for years, the sense that I moved through the world more easily than she did, that people warmed to me faster, that opportunities seemed to find me without as much struggle, that our mother, without ever meaning to play favorites, had a way of speaking about me with a particular pride that never quite extended the same way to her. I didn't see any of this clearly while it was happening. I only felt, over the years, a low hum of distance between us that I attributed to normal sibling friction, the kind every family has, never once suspecting it was curdling into something else entirely. By the time I married Terrence, 6 years ago, Delphine and I had settled into a relationship that looked functional from the outside: holiday dinners together, birthday calls, the appearance of closeness, while something colder ran underneath it that neither of us ever addressed directly. Terrence liked her well enough. He used to joke, in the easy way people joke about things they don't understand the weight of, that he was lucky he'd never accidentally end up flirting with the wrong sister at a family gathering, because we looked so alike it would be an honest mistake. I used to laugh along with him. I had no idea back then how close that joke would come to describing my actual life. The wrongness started small, so small I nearly missed it entirely. It was a Tuesday evening, maybe 8 months ago now, and Terrence came home from work and thanked me, warmly, genuinely, for the dinner I'd made him the night before, a shrimp and grits recipe he said had been the best version I'd ever cooked. I had no memory of making that dinner. I remembered making myself a sandwich the night before and going to bed early with a headache. I laughed it off in the moment, told him he must be thinking of a different night, and he insisted, with a kind of easy certainty that made me doubt myself instead of him, that it had absolutely been the previous evening, that we'd even talked about repainting the guest room while we ate. I let it go. People misremember days all the time, I told myself. It was such a small thing to build suspicion on. But the small things kept happening, each one easy to dismiss on its own, harder and harder to dismiss as they piled up together. A neighbor, Miss Loretta from 2 houses down, waved at me at the grocery store and said she'd enjoyed chatting with me at the mailbox the week before, a conversation I had absolutely no memory of having. I told myself she must have been mistaken about which day, or mistaken about who she'd spoken to. Then a charge appeared on our shared card for a boutique across town, a store I had never once set foot in, on a day I had been at work from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening with no gaps in between. I checked my work badge logs afterward, almost embarrassed at my own paranoia. and confirmed I had genuinely been at my desk the entire time the charge was made. Then a friend from my book club, Yvonne, texted me laughing about running into me downtown on Tuesday, except I had been 40 minutes away at a work conference that entire day, a fact I could prove with hotel receipts and a conference badge. Each incident alone had an innocent explanation I could talk myself into. Together, laid end to end, they formed a pattern that made the hair on my arms stand up every time I thought about it too long. The night everything truly cracked open began with an argument that made no sense to me from the very first sentence. Terrence came home unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that told me something had shifted, and when I asked him what was wrong, he looked at me with an expression I had never seen him wear before: hurt, confused, almost accusatory. "Why didn't you tell me you were upset about the anniversary trip?" he said. "You could have just said something instead of going cold on me at dinner last night." I had no idea what he was talking about. I told him so, plainly, and watched his confusion deepen into something closer to frustration. He described, in specific detail, a dinner the two of us had supposedly had the night before at a restaurant downtown, a conversation about postponing our upcoming anniversary trip, a version of me who had apparently gone quiet and distant across the table when he brought up the postponement, refusing to explain why. I had been at my sister Delphine's apartment the entire previous evening, helping her set up a new bookshelf, a detail I could easily prove through the delivery receipt for the bookshelf itself and text messages between us confirming the time. "Terrence," I said slowly, my heart starting to pound in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with a fear I didn't yet have a name for, "I was not at dinner with you last night. I was at Delphine's apartment until almost 10 o'clock. I can show you the messages." He stared at me for a long moment, and I watched something in his face shift from frustration to genuine unease, the same unease now crawling up my own spine. "That doesn't make sense," he said quietly. "I was with you. I know I was with you. She looked exactly like you. She sounded exactly like you. She knew things only you would know." He stopped himself mid-sentence, and I watched him arrive, almost in real time, at the same impossible conclusion I was arriving at from the opposite direction. "She knew things only I would know," I repeated back to him, my voice barely above a whisper now. "Terrence, I have an identical twin sister." I want to be honest about how strange it feels to say those words out loud in that context, to hear your own husband slowly realize that an entire evening he lived through, an entire conversation he believed he had with his wife, may have happened with someone else wearing her face. He sat down heavily on the edge of our bed, running both hands over his head, and for a long time neither of us said anything at all, because there was nothing small enough to say about something that large. Piece by piece, comparing dates and details, we started reconstructing what had actually happened over the past several months. The dinner where I'd supposedly cooked shrimp and grits and discussed repainting the guest room. The conversation at the mailbox with Miss Loretta. The sighting downtown that Yvonne had mentioned. The charge at the boutique. Every single incident lined up, once we laid them out together, with times I had confirmed alibis for. And every single one of them lined up with times Delphine's own schedule was suspiciously unaccounted for, according to the vague answers she'd given when I'd casually asked what she'd been up to on this day or that. We sat at the kitchen table with a notepad between us, writing dates in one column and Delphine's known whereabouts in the other, and the pattern grew more disturbing the longer we worked at it. There was a weekend, back in early spring, when she'd told our mother she was taking a solo trip to clear her head after a rough breakup, unreachable by phone for most of 2 days. Terrence remembered, with a growing horror on his face, a Saturday around that same time when I had supposedly stopped by his office unannounced with lunch, chatted with two of his coworkers by name, and left after 20 minutes because I had errands to run. I had never once done that in 6 years of marriage. I don't even know the names of most of his coworkers. Delphine, it turned out, did, because I had mentioned them to her myself, in passing, over the years, never imagining the details would someday be used to build a convincing impression of my own life. I sat with that realization for a long time before I said anything out loud, because some part of me still didn't want it to be true. Sisters, even distant ones, even ones carrying old wounds neither of you ever fully addressed, are not supposed to do this to each other. But the evidence didn't care what I wanted to believe. My sister had been slipping into pieces of my marriage, using our identical faces, our identical voices, A lifetime of mannerisms she knew as well as her own, because in many ways they were her own, and she had been doing it deliberately, methodically, for months, while I went about my life with no idea that someone had been living parts of it without me. I didn't confront her right away. Terrence wanted to call her that same night, furious and hurt and demanding answers, but I stopped him. I told him that if I accused Delphine directly, with nothing but circumstantial pieces and no witness to the actual moment of impersonation, she would deny it completely, and given how convincingly she'd apparently already fooled my own husband, I had no doubt she could talk her way out of an accusation without proof. I needed to catch her in the act, not confront a shadow she could simply deny into nothing. Our mother's 84th birthday dinner was coming up in 3 weeks, the whole family gathering at her house the way we did every year, and I decided that would be the moment. I didn't tell Terrence my full plan until a few days before, because I needed him calm and steady rather than simmering with the kind of anger that might tip Delphine off before I was ready. The plan itself was simple, almost embarrassingly so once I'd worked it out. I would arrive at the dinner separately from Terrence, later than expected, giving Delphine a window of time in which, if she was going to attempt anything, she would believe she had room to do it. I watched from my car outside my mother's house for almost 20 minutes before going in, my hands cold against the steering wheel, wondering if I was about to prove something unbearable or embarrass myself, chasing a paranoid theory that had no basis at all. When I finally walked through the front door, the sound of the party already in full swing, I saw Terrence standing in the kitchen doorway with his back to me, talking easily, warmly, to a woman with my exact face, wearing a dress nearly identical to one I owned, standing just a little too close to him, laughing at something he'd said in a way that made my stomach twist even though I understood, intellectually, that I was looking at my own sister and not myself. I didn't say anything right away. I stood at the edge of the room and watched, my heart hammering, as my mother came around the corner carrying a tray of appetizers, glancing toward the kitchen doorway the way hosts do when they're keeping half an eye on their gathering. Augustine stopped mid-step. I watched her eyes move from Delphine to Terrence and back again, and something in her face changed. Not confusion, not the usual double-take strangers gave us, but a slow, dawning recognition that had nothing to do with which twin was which, and everything to do with what she was witnessing. Delphine, she said, her voice carrying an edge I had rarely heard her use in my entire life, why are you standing like that? It was such a strange thing to say out loud, standing like that, and yet I understood instantly what she meant, because I had grown up watching my sister my entire life and I recognized it too, now that it had been named. Delphine had a particular way of tilting her head when she laughed at something a man said that she found flattering, a small, specific, unconscious gesture that was different, subtly, almost invisibly, but definitely, from the way I laughed at the same kind of moment. Our mother, who had spent 50-plus years learning to tell her daughters apart by exactly these kinds of details when the rest of the world couldn't, had just watched her own daughter perform a version of me that didn't quite match the original, standing in a kitchen with my husband, and she had caught the lie in a single unconscious tilt of the head. Delphine's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, then defensiveness, then something that looked almost like relief. The specific relief of someone who has been carrying a secret so long that even having it discovered feels like putting down a weight they were tired of holding. Mama, I don't know what you're talking about, she tried, but her voice had already lost its footing, and Augustine was already crossing the kitchen toward her, setting the tray down hard enough that a few appetizers slid sideways. I carried the two of you inside me for 9 months, Augustine said, her voice shaking now, somewhere between fury and heartbreak. I have looked at your face every single day since the day you were born. Do not stand in my kitchen and tell me I don't know my own daughter, even when she's trying not to be recognized as herself. That was the moment everyone else in the house seemed to notice something was wrong. Conversation dying down room by room as relatives drifted toward the kitchen, drawn by the sudden tension the way people always are. I stepped forward then, finally, and Terrence turned at the sound of my voice, his face draining of color as he looked between me standing in the doorway and Delphine standing 3 feet from him, both of us in nearly matching dresses, both of us with the same face staring back at him from two different directions. I think, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, you owe everyone in this room an explanation of how long you've been doing this. The room went silent enough that I could hear the tray Augustine had set down, still rattling slightly against the counter. Delphine didn't try to deny it any further once she understood there was nowhere left to run. What came out of her, over the next hour, in pieces, between long silences and our mother's occasional interjections of pure disbelief, was a confession that had clearly been building inside her for far longer than the 8 months she'd actually spent acting on it. She told us she had never stopped resenting how easily things came to me, how our mother spoke about me with a pride she never quite matched when she spoke about her, how even the old wound from 19 years old, the boy who had chosen me, had never fully scarred over the way everyone assumed it had. She said that somewhere along the way, watching my marriage to Terrence from the outside, watching what looked to her like an easy, warm life, something in her had decided that if she couldn't have a version of that life built on her own foundation, she would simply borrow mine, piece by piece, whenever the chance presented itself. Augustine stood at the edge of the kitchen through most of it, one hand pressed flat against her chest, and at one point she asked Delphine, in a voice that had gone very quiet after its earlier fury, whether she understood what she had actually done. Not just to me, not just to Terrence, but to the idea of trust between all of us going forward, the assumption every family in this room would now carry that the sister standing in front of them might, at any given moment, not be who she claimed to be. Delphine didn't have an answer for that. She just stood there, still in her nearly matching dress, looking, for the first time since I'd walked through that door, less like a woman who had gotten away with something and more like a woman who had never actually believed she'd get caught and now had to sit inside the wreckage of what getting caught actually meant. It started small, she admitted, showing up at places where people might mistake her for me, letting the confusion stand instead of correcting it, enjoying the strange thrill of being treated, even briefly, like the version of herself she believed people preferred. But it had escalated further than she'd initially intended, culminating in actual planned visits to my own house on days she knew I'd be away, actual conversations with my own husband where she let him believe, for hours at a time, that he was talking to his wife. Terrence's reaction, once the full shape of it had been laid out in front of him, was somewhere between fury and a kind of shaken disorientation I had never seen on him before. He didn't yell. He looked mostly like a man trying to understand how much of what he thought he'd experienced in his own home over the past several months had actually happened to him at all, and how much of it had happened to a stranger wearing his wife's face. I won't pretend the weeks after that dinner were simple. Terrence and I spent long nights going back through everything, trying to identify every single moment Delphine had inserted herself into, trying to separate what was real from what had been borrowed. There was a strange, almost dizzying quality to those conversations. Sitting across from my own husband and asking him to describe, in detail, moments he'd shared with a woman who looked exactly like me, listening for small differences in the way she'd phrased things, the way she'd reacted to something he said, trying to reconstruct a stranger's performance of my own life well enough to know exactly where the impersonation started and stopped. Some nights it felt less like healing a marriage and more like conducting an investigation into my own identity. It rebuilt something between us, oddly enough, that strange shared reconstruction, not because the betrayal brought us closer in some easy, uncomplicated way, but because we had to relearn, deliberately and carefully, exactly what trust in our own marriage actually looked like when it had been tested by something neither of us had ever imagined needing to guard against. Terrence started doing something he'd never done before. Something small, but that meant more to me than he probably realized. Texting me little details throughout the day, not out of suspicion, but so that there would never again be a gap in our shared history large enough for someone else to slip into. I found myself doing the same, narrating small pieces of my day unprompted, not because I doubted him, but because I understood now how easily a marriage's ordinary silences could be mistaken by someone determined enough for an opening. Delphine and I have not spoken since that birthday dinner. Our mother calls both of us separately now, careful in a way she never used to have to be, trying to hold together two daughters who used to share a face and now can't seem to share a room. I don't know if Delphine and I will ever repair what broke that night, or if some fractures, once a lifetime of quiet resentment finally breaks the surface, simply aren't built to close back over. I think about her sometimes with more sadness than anger, understanding now that what she did came from a wound so old neither of us had ever properly tended to it, though understanding where a betrayal comes from has never once made me feel obligated to pretend it didn't happen. What I learned from all of this is something I don't think I could have understood any other way: that the people closest to you, The ones who know your habits and your voice and your face better than anyone alive are capable of using that closeness as easily as a stranger could use a lie. Trust isn't just about believing the people in front of you. Sometimes it's about staying awake enough, even in the most familiar relationships in your life, to notice when the person standing in your kitchen isn't quite standing the way you would. If you're watching this and you've ever felt that strange, disorienting sense that something in your own life doesn't quite add up, trust that feeling long enough to look closer. Because sometimes the smallest inconsistencies are the first thread of something much larger unraveling. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you have a twin, a sibling, or anyone in your life who knows you closely enough to either protect you or exploit you, I hope it's the first one. Subscribe to Black Hope so you never miss the next story. And if this one kept you on the edge of your seat, send it to someone who needs a story like this tonight. I'll see you in the next one.